For the past 2 weeks, almost every conversation around Big Bear has centered on one eagle, KD1. Every arrival has been noticed. Every landing has been replayed. Every quiet moment beside Shadow has been watched closely by thousands of viewers searching for clues. Is KD1 simply passing through? Is this young eagle interested in Shadow? Has Shadow accepted the newcomer? Could this be the beginning of a new chapter at Big Bear? Those are the questions everyone has been asking. But looking back now, we may have been paying attention to the wrong eagle. Because perhaps the most important clues were never in what KD1 was doing. They were in what Shadow wasn't doing. No chase, no prolonged warning calls, no obvious attempt to force the newcomer away. Again and again, KD1 entered Shadow's world, and Shadow remained surprisingly calm. To understand why that matters, we have to go back, not to August 13th when KD1 entered the nest beside Shadow, but to August 6th, because that quiet morning may have been where this story truly began. Shadow was perched in one of the familiar trees overlooking Big Bear Valley. Nothing seemed unusual. Then another bald eagle arrived. The young eagle landed on the same pine tree only a short distance from Shadow. At first, there was little reason to think much of it. Young bald eagles travel through unfamiliar territory all the time. Some stay only a few minutes. Others remain for several hours before continuing on. A single encounter does not tell us very much, but something about this one immediately stood out. Not because of what happened, because of what didn't. Shadow did not chase the newcomer. There was no obvious territorial confrontation, no prolonged pursuit, no extended calling. Neither eagle seemed interested in escalating the situation. Instead, they remained in the same tree, quietly sharing the space. One peaceful encounter cannot tell us what two wild eagles are thinking. Shadow's calm response did not necessarily mean acceptance. KD1's presence did not mean the young eagle intended to stay. If KD1 had disappeared after that morning, the encounter probably would have been forgotten. But KD1 returned, then returned again, and that changed everything. One appearance can be chance. A second appearance can still be coincidence. But when the same eagle begins appearing repeatedly, the question changes. It is no longer simply, who is that eagle? It becomes, why does that eagle keep coming back? Over the next several days, the same pattern continued. KD1 remained around the area. Shadow remained nearby. And once again, there was no obvious prolonged territorial conflict, no repeated chase, no serious effort to drive KD1 away. Each encounter by itself seemed small. Together, they began to form something much more interesting, a pattern. And this is often how wildlife stories develop. Not through one dramatic moment, but through a series of quiet observations that slowly begin connecting together. By August 10th, KD1's repeated appearances were becoming difficult to dismiss as random. Another bald eagle had visited the nest several days earlier. That visitor stayed briefly, called several times, looked around, and then left. It did not return again and again. KD1 did. That difference mattered. It still did not tell us why KD1 was returning, and it certainly did not tell us what Shadow was thinking. But it suggested KD1 was no longer behaving like a visitor simply passing through once. And now the most interesting question became Shadow. How was he responding? At first, the answer seemed almost disappointing. Shadow rarely did much. He perched. He watched. Eventually, he flew away. Compared with KD1's increasing curiosity, Shadow appeared almost unchanged. But sometimes the quietest animal in the frame can reveal the most. Because across all those encounters, one detail remained remarkably consistent. Shadow never made a serious attempt to chase KD1 away. There was no prolonged pursuit, no repeated territorial attack, no obvious campaign to force the younger eagle out of the area. For a resident bald eagle, that absence is worth noticing, but it is equally important not to push the evidence too far. There was also no clear courtship, no established pattern of mutual preening, no coordinated nest work, no obvious sign that Shadow was actively encouraging a closer relationship. The footage showed neither clear acceptance nor clear rejection, and that distinction matters. Nature does not always move in clean, obvious steps. Sometimes behavior exists somewhere between yes and no. KD1 kept returning. Shadow kept allowing those returns without an obvious major confrontation. Beyond that, we still did not have enough evidence to say exactly what the relationship meant. Then 3 days later, everything became more interesting. KD1 entered the nest while Shadow was there. This was no longer simply a young eagle appearing somewhere in the surrounding forest. KD1 had stepped directly into the nest associated with Jackie and Shadow for years. Many viewers might have expected a strong reaction, but once again it never came. No sudden attack, no dramatic chase, no obvious territorial explosion. Shadow remained remarkably calm. And perhaps that quiet response was more significant than any dramatic confrontation could have been, because it matched what had already been happening for days. KD1 approached, Shadow watched, and the situation did not escalate. Then KD1's behavior began changing. The young eagle moved sticks around the nest. Fresh branches were brought in. KD1 appeared more confident around Shadow. At times, KD1 even seemed to gently touch Shadow's beak and preen feathers around his face. Those moments immediately attracted attention. It would be tempting to look at them and decide the mystery had finally been solved. But wildlife rarely gives us answers that easily. One interaction does not define a relationship. One nest visit does not tell us what will happen next. Behavior has to be understood over time. And when we look back at the entire sequence, August 13th suddenly feels less like the beginning of the story and more like the latest step in something that had already been developing. First, KD1 appeared near Shadow. Then KD1 returned, then returned again. The two continued sharing space without obvious, prolonged conflict. Day after day, KD1 became a more familiar presence. And throughout those encounters, Shadow's response remained restrained. That does not prove acceptance. It does not prove courtship. And it certainly does not tell us what happens next. But by the time KD1 entered the nest beside Shadow, this was no longer the story of one random visitor. A pattern had formed, and perhaps that was the clue many of us almost missed. We were waiting for Shadow to do something dramatic, but the real story may have been developing through what he chose not to do. Every time KD1 returned, Shadow had another opportunity to drive the young eagle away. Yet the clear rejection many viewers might have expected never came. Sometimes nature reveals change through action. Sometimes it reveals change through tolerance. And sometimes the most interesting behavior is the behavior that never happens. So perhaps the question is no longer simply, why didn't Shadow react? Perhaps the better question is, how long had Shadow already been tolerating KD1 before we realized that his quiet response was part of the story? Because KD1 kept returning, Shadow remained calm. And slowly, almost unnoticed, a stranger began spending more and more time inside a landscape that had once been unfamiliar. But that leaves us with an even bigger mystery. Who exactly is KD1? Where did this young eagle come from? Why Big Bear? And out of all the places this eagle could have explored, why keep returning here? The answer may not begin with Shadow. It may begin with KD1's journey long before arriving at Big Bear. Because KD1's story did not begin in this nest. It began somewhere else. And understanding that journey may reveal far more than we expect.